folks, Scott here from a snowy New York City with the new My Monthly Hero for February of 2026. This is the My Monthly Hero and the My Monthly Superhero Kit. Our theme this month is In Full Bloom. And that brings us to our first set in the My Monthly Hero. We get the Happy Spring stamp and cut. So this is the stamp set. We've got 3 little bunnies, flowers, a couple of eggs, Happy Spring, Happy Easter, Thinking of You, Happy Spring stamp and cut set. So there are dies for all of the bunnies, for all the eggs, for all of the flowers. That's our first piece. And then we get the Field of Flowers layering stencil set. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 layering stencils. These look like they'll give us a complete background of spring flowers. Let's see here. Yes, look at that. There you go. A complete background with multi-layered flowers and leaves. That's the second part in the My Monthly Hero. And then the third part in My Monthly Hero is the Springtime Blooms die set with lots of leaves and flowers and layering flowers. It looks like a little bow here. Lots of stems, assorted leaves and centers. Lots and lots of springtime blooms. Then we also get a color wheel cardstock assortment. We get 10 sheets of 8.5 by 5.5 inch cardstock. Those come to us in Cascade, Fern, Rainforest, Mint, Carrot, Coral, Bellini, Chiffon, Beeswax, and Alabaster. That's our 10 sheets of 8.5 by 5.5 inch cardstock. And then we get to the My Monthly Superheroes. So in the Superhero Kit, you get everything that is in the My Monthly Hero Kit, plus the Happy Spring layering stencil. What's interesting here is that this stencil set actually fits our Happy Spring stamp set. So here you can see the little bunnies line up perfectly with those stencils. The bunnies line up, the flowers line up. Everything on this stamp set lines up with this stencil set. So you could stamp everything and then color everything with these layering stencils. Then you get the Wildflowers stamp and cut. So the Wildflower stamp and cut consists of this stamp set, again, a 4 by 6 inch stamp set with a good amount of sentiments here. We've got thanks a bunch, one day at a time, miss you, hello, you're the best, hello friend, thank you, I'm sorry, I forgot. Lots of solid flower stamps, stems, leaves, centers, all of this along with dies to cut them all out. And of course the dies include sentiment dies for all of the little sentiments in this kit as well. And then we also get the Bunny Trio die set. 3 little bunnies, 3 little eggs, 3 little tails, a little bit of, oh no, these look like bows. These have got to be little bows to go on the bunnies' necks. We're not quite done. We also have a grass die. This is a nice grass die that's virtually 6 inches long, so you can use it on any orientation on an A2 card. That's everything in our My Monthly Hero Superhero Kit for February of 2026. In full bloom, let's start playing with some bunnies and some flowers. And here we have our 10 cards for the month. I tell you, much of the country is dealing with exceedingly low temperatures this week, and a good dose of spring is just what we all need. Everything's on an A2 white card base. As usual, I like to take the sets one by one. So let's start with the Hoppy Spring stamp and cut set from the Hero Kit. You probably know by now that I'm not a big fan of the borders left on stamped images by their matching dies, and I often prefer to do a little mask cutting to create a vignette using only the stamps. That gives us our first card, and we have our lovely bunny trio with a big flower. You open up and it says, Happy Spring. This scene was easy to stamp as I only had to create a mask for the front bunny. I stamped the front bunny using VersaFine Onyx Black ink on Bristol Smooth cardstock, and I stamped a second one onto masking paper and fussy cut that out. Then it was a simple matter of masking off the front bunny and then stamping the flower and the two other bunnies on top, again using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. When the ink was nice and dry, I colored the scene with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. I did reach for my Pebbles chalk palette to blend in the soft background colors. Very subtle, but it's grounding for this image. I die cut the colored panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I added a thin black mat and a thin yellow mat behind that before gluing them all down to an A2 white card base. Now, I couldn't figure out where a sentiment should go on this little vignette, so I just left the front alone and added our sentiment to the inside of the card. There's an interesting juxtaposition of the large flower and the small bunnies. I do believe bunnies are probably as big or even larger than most flowers, but this must be a special first of spring flower that stands taller than anything else. Happy Spring! Now, another scene occurred to me that was along the same lines as that first card, but uses other stamps in this set. And that gives us our Thinking of You card. This time, I had to cut a mask for the petal and the large egg, and I just stamped the top part of this largest flower, and then I completed the stem with a ruler and a Pigma Micron pen. So this was pretty easy masking as well. This is all stamped and colored with the same materials used in the first card, but this time I left myself a little room for a sentiment that is stamped with VersaFine Onyx Black ink and embossed with some clear embossing powder. You may notice that the butterfly is flying downwards. The butterfly stamp was actually still attached to the largest flower stamp when I took it off of the backing, and I just simply left it as it is without noticing that it was facing down. But, you know, butterflies fly in all directions, so I decided to leave it as is. I did think of the petal here as a bit of a blanket protecting the eggs, but whether that reads or not, it's debatable. Again, I used my Pebbles chalk palette for the soft background. So easy. If you scrub your chalk pastels into the background, they do not come off at all. I die cut the colored panel to 3 1/2 by 4 3/4 with a Hero Arts rectangle infinity die. No, I didn't use my Lawn Fawn Stitch rectangle dies. Then I added thin mats of black and a pale yellow cardstock before gluing them all down to an A2 white card base. I highlighted the eggs with some white dots using a white gel pen for a little bit of added texture. I do love coloring with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers, and I really like the flowers on this card. Thinking of You. So those two cards used up most of the stamps in the Hoppy Spring Stamp and Cut set. So let's move along to the Field of Flowers layering stencils. Now, I did get the new release of the Sarah Renee Clark's Color Cubes, Volume 1 and 2, for my birthday in December. And since I always find it a little daunting picking colors for layering stencils, I turned to the Volume 1 Spring tab and selected card 187 for a color palette to use with the layering stencils. I selected Hero Hues Blue Raspberry, Green Apple, Grape Slush, Fruit Punch, and Splash Reactive inks to match this palette. The Blue Raspberry was probably the most off from the palette, but I did see a lot of blue in this dark green color, and I thought the Blue Raspberry worked quite nicely. I did find it completely enjoyable to search through the color cubes and match a palette card. I didn't fret about choosing my own colors or about returning to my old standbys. And that gives us a lovely thank you card. Isn't that a pleasing color palette? I used Grape Slush and Splash for the flowers on stencil number 1. I used Fruit Punch, light on the dots and heavy on the tulips, for stencil number 2. Green Apple, both light and dark, for stencil number 3. And Blue Raspberry for stencil number 4. I die cut the stencil panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I added a thin mat of metallic green from the, this is from the Tim Holtz Metallic Jewels craft stock pad. I glued that to an A2 white card base. Now, I thought this stencil background was a little busy for any die-cut flowers or stamps from the hero set, but figured that a nice big sentiment would work. The thank you, this is an old Doris Sentiments for Card Making die that has been in my stash for many, many years. This may be my first time I'm actually using it. I die cut the sentiment from more of the metallic green craft cardstock, and I added 3 die cut blanks behind the green for a nice chunky sentiment. I glued those to the card front. I did grab the little dots die from the Springtime Blooms die set and die cut all 9 of them from the same cardstock and added them to the card front for a little extra bling that just happens to match perfectly. I think a large sentiment works brilliantly on this rather busy, flowery background. Now, it must have been working with that metallic cardstock that gave me the idea for this next card. I do like using more than just inks with my stencils. How about some added texture too? And that gives us a hello card with all sorts of shimmery, shiny, gold and green and blue accents using those stencils. So I used Nouveau Embellishment Mousse in Cornflower Blue for stencil number 1, Gold Hero Wax for stencil number 2, that's the really shiny ones there, love that gold wax, Nouveau Embellishment Mousse in Citrus Green for stencil number 3, and Hero Wax in Olive Hero Wax for stencil number 4. Of course, I had to let each layer dry before moving on to the next stencil. And after I had done that first stencil, the blue, I realized that the depth of the mousse or wax would interfere with the accuracy of the other layers. I did my best to minimize the over smooshing by pressing very hard through the stencils with my palette knife. That worked surprisingly well, though I did get some overflow, especially with that last stencil. All of the stenciled embellishments have a great shimmer to them, and the gold hero wax positively shines. Look at that. So I reached for the pale greenish yellow metallic cardstock. This comes from the Tim Holtz Metallic Confections craft stock pad for the thin mat and the sentiment. I trimmed this background down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches by hand. I didn't want to risk sending it through the die cutting machine, and I added the thin mat behind before gluing to the card front. The Hello Sentiment dies are from the Love from Lizzie June 2021 card kit. I cut 1 from the metallic cardstock and 2 from plain white cardstock. I glued 1 of the white ones behind the metallic sentiment and then glued those to the shadow die. That, of course, was cut from some thick vellum. And then I glued the other white hello layer behind the vellum. So that adds some lift to the whole sentiment so it doesn't have to compete with the textures on the card front. That's a very different look than the ink blended stenciling. Hello, much more shiny too. So that still gives me the Springtime Blooms die set in the Hero Kit. The two largest flowers have extra petals too. So these are extra petals for this large bloom. These are extra petals for the smaller bloom. And that gives us our Thanks a Bunch card. Isn't that nice? So I die cut the blooms from the chiffon cardstock included in the kit. One big bloom with two layering petals, and then two of the smaller blooms with doubles of their layering petals. Now, I received a 12-pack of Comte à Paris pastel crayons for Christmas, so I decided to try using them for some color blending on the petals. These are waxier and much firmer than regular pastels, and they have superb pigments. They're very interesting to play with, and they gave me some nicely shaded petals on the flowers. I did use a large ball stylus to give all of the petals some shape. I used it in the center, from the front, and then on each petal from the back. I think that gives the blooms terrific dimension without adding too much depth. I glued the petals together, 3 pieces for each bloom, and I die cut the centers from some textured gold paper. This stuff works really good for centers of flowers. I did use the ball stylus to give a little shape to the centerpiece on this large bloom, and I mounted that in place with glue carefully applied around the edges. I glued the smaller centers directly to the center of the other 2 blooms. I die cut all of the stems from plain green cardstock from my stash, and when I realized how thin the stems were, I figured I should double them up for a little strength. So I die cut the stems again from some lighter green cardstock and glued the 2 colors together, a tiny bit offset to create some shading on the stems without having to color them. Now I die cut the dotted stems twice from the same colors of green and glued them together with the darker green on top. I die cut a batch of dots in metallic red and in metallic white cardstock and glued all of those to the dots at the end of those stems. Now I masked off an inch all the way around a white A2 card base, and I ink blended some Hero Hues Lemon Drop Reactive ink in the center, heavier to the right and a little lighter to the left. Before removing the masking, I spattered some Hero Arts brown acrylic speckle on top of that ink blending, and I let that all dry before removing the mask. I decided on an arrangement of flowers, and I stamped the sentiment on the card front using walnut-stained Distress Oxide ink and embossed that with some clear embossing powder. I glued all of the flowers to the card front, and I die cut the little string tie from some auburn pearlescent cardstock and glued that in place. I tell you, spending just a little time giving the petals some shaping really brings these springtime blooms to life. Thanks a bunch. Now, that's a pretty thorough examination of the Hero Kit. It's time to break out the Superhero Kit, more bunnies and blooms. So the Superhero Kit starts with the Hoppy Spring layering stencil set, providing stencils to color all of the flowers and bunnies in the Hoppy Spring stamp and cut set. Now here's what that layout looks like taken directly from the stencils. I did stamp the outlines after stenciling with Concord & Ninth Dove ink for the flowers and Mushroom ink for the bunnies. I got the stamps lined up with the stencils pretty good. Be careful with those stems. You could also stamp the images and then use the stencils to color them individually. You just have to take some extra care with the layering. Now, I used Hero Hues Lemon Drop and Creamsicle Reactive inks for the blooms, Hero Arts Green Apple Reactive ink and Concord & Ninth Parsley ink for the stems, Concord & Ninth Dove ink for the left bunny, antique linen and vintage photo distress oxide inks for the center bunny, and walnut stain distress oxide ink for the bunny on the right. Ultimately, I decided to forego the stencil arrangement, and I just die cut everything out. And that gives us our Hello Friend card. The smallest bloom and the two small bunnies make up this fun vignette. I die cut some white cardstock to 2 1/4 inches by 3 1/2 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I stamped the sentiment towards the bottom with hickory smoke distress oxide ink, and I embossed it with some clear embossing powder. I added a thin dark gray mat behind. I die cut a plain piece of green cardstock to 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 inches, again with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I embossed that with the Spellbinders Leafy 3D embossing folder using Hero Arts Green Apple Reactive ink on the negative side to add a bit of darker color in the background of the embossed leaves. I added a thin dark gray mat behind the green embossed panel and glued those to the center of a white card base. I glued the sentiment panel in the center and then glued the die cuts in place with the flower in the hands of the gray bunny. I added some black Nuvo drops to the bunny eyes, and I even added a little white dot for just a touch of personality. Hello, friend. And of course, I have all those other stenciled die cuts just staring at me, and that gives us our Miss You card with the larger bunny and the rest of the blooms. Now, this background is colored with my new Comte de Paris pastel crayons. These colors blend together so beautifully and hold tight to the cardstock when rubbed in. I'm not getting any lift of that whatsoever. You can see my fingers not picking up any of that, and I did not seal this. I love having another option for creating blended backgrounds, and I think the softness of the colors lends itself well to a springtime theme. I trimmed the background to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. I stamped the sentiment using hickory smoke distress oxide ink and embossed that with some clear embossing powder. I added a dark gray mat to the background and glued those to an A2 white card base. I added the die cuts using thin foam tape and glue. The right bloom and the bottom of the stems are all glued flat, and everything else is attached with foam tape. The smell of these flowers reminds me of you. I miss you. Now that appears to be the big crossover between the hero and superhero kits this month. Now we have the Wildflowers stamp and cut. I decided to try something a little bit different with these solid flower stamps. And that gives us You're the Best with all these bright, bright, bright colored flowers on black cardstock. So I arranged all the bloom and leaf stamps in a grouping and stamped the group on opposite ends of some plain black cardstock using Hero Arts Unicorn White ink. I let that ink dry completely, and then I colored all the white stampings with my Prismacolor colored pencils. I think this is about the only way to actually color on black cardstock, unless you're using some type of gouache or acrylic paint markers. I really like these bright blooms on a black background. I trimmed the stamped and colored panel to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. I added a thin white mat and a thin black mat before gluing them all to a white card base. I stamped the sentiment with Hero Arts Unicorn White ink and embossed that with white embossing powder. Now, I do have a clipboard covered with a nonstick craft mat that has lots of different colors and brands of enamel dots already dried and standing by. I chose a bunch of different colors and I used them for all the centers of all the blooms here. Those add a great dimension to an otherwise flat card. And a couple of maroon enamel dots finishes up the sentiment and pulls this whole card together. You're the best. Now, sometimes when I'm faced with an assortment of flower stamps and dies, I find that narrowing the scope down to just one type of flower often helps me focus on a design that might feel a little innovative and yet isn't necessarily so. The Wildflowers Stamp and Cut set has 2 different sized cone flowers, so let's use those. And you know, I hate white die cut borders, so let's stamp these on colored cardstock. And that gives us another thank you card. Oh, so pretty, just the cone flowers. So I stamped a pair of the cone flowers on pale yellow cardstock with Conqueror Ninth, Buttercup, and Poppy inks, and on darker yellow cardstock, I stamped a pair with Hero Art's Lemon Drop and Creamsicle reactive inks. I stamped 1 pair on orange cardstock with Hero Art's Creamsicle reactive ink and Conqueror Ninth Marmalade ink. For the last pair, I stamped light purple cardstock with Hero Art's Grape Slush reactive ink and Conqueror Ninth Eggplant ink. Using ink cubes and a small blending brush helps to blend the colors on the flower stamps. And I did stamp the 2 flower centers on each color of cardstock as well using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I die cut the flowers and centers with their matching dies, and instead of gluing centers on top of the petals, I cut away the center from the petal stamps and glued the centers behind the petals. That makes for a seamless flower without a die-cut border between the center and the petals. I think that really enhances the look of these flowers. I stamped all of the stems and leaves on light green cardstock using Hero Art's Green Apple reactive ink, and again on dark green cardstock using Conqueror Ninth Evergreen ink, and then I die-cut them all out. I did stamp the shortest stem on both green cardstocks once more to use as extras at the bottom of the bouquet. Now I glued the yellow flowers to the light green stems and the orange and purple flowers to the dark green stems, arranged them in a pleasing bouquet along with the 6 leaves. Since some of the stems were short, I added my extra stems cut in half, so I had 4 at the bottom of the bouquet to fill out those shorter stems. I thought the colors of these flowers worked especially well on a black background, so I die cut a panel of glossy black cardstock to 2 3/4 inches by 4 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I die cut a panel of rainbow mirror cardstock to 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 and glued them together and then down to a white card base. Now, I picked glossy black and rainbow mirror cardstock because I had this pre-made sentiment that I wanted to use. It's from a Spellbinders Simon Hurley must-have sentiments glimmer plate and die set. I have a whole bunch of those sentiments sitting by in just a little envelope here, standing by for me to use whenever I have them. I thought this was a great opportunity to use one of those sentiments. That inspired me to use the glossy black and the rainbow mirror cardstock. I actually glued the bouquet flat to the card front. The only dimension is the layering of the cardstock, and I added the sentiment with foam tape. I really like this card. Thank you. Now that leaves us with the Bunny Trio die set and the grass die. Though, of course, I find it hard to imagine any card maker without a grass die in their stash. Now I have 2. And that gives us our last card this month, a Happy Easter card that features the rest of the dies in this superhero kit. Now, I die cut a 3 3/4 by 5 inch panel of white cardstock with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I colored the sky with my Comte de Paris pastel crayons. Now, I might have to give those a try with a cloud stencil sometime. Now, I die cut the 3 grass dies from some Altenew Green Meadows Gradient cardstock set, and I trimmed them to size with the same Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I die cut the bunnies with some 110-pound white cardstock And since there are bunny tail dies, I flocked one side of a piece of score tape with Ink-a-Dink-a-Doo linen white flocking powder. And I die cut the tails from that and stuck them to the bunny's butts. Now, I don't use my flocking powders often, but they sure come in handy sometimes. You can actually see that those tails are fuzzy. I die cut the bunny bows from chiffon cardstock and glued them to the bunnies. Then I die cut the eggs from more of the metallic confections cardstock. I stamped the sentiment in the sky with Hero Art's unicorn white ink and embossed that with white embossing powder. I glued the grass strips to the panel, hid the eggs among the grass, and tucked the bunnies in place, gluing them on their bottoms and using thin foam tape on their heads and ears. I did use my Pebbles chalk palette to blend some pink onto the bunny ears and noses, and I used some light gray to add a touch of shading on their bodies. Very subtle. I also added black enamel dots to the bunny's eyes. I took a 110-pound white card base and I used an Ohuhu alcohol marker to draw a pink border on the card front. Then I glued a white die-cut Moda-Scrap framed rectangle to the card front, and I glued the main panel on top of that. Now, though I thought it was frivolous at first, I do actually love the little fuzzy bunny tails and the frolicsome nature of these koi bunnies. Happy Easter! And that wraps up my 10 in full bloom cards inspired by the My Monthly Superhero Kit for February of 2026. Thanks to some cute bunnies, this kit inspired a wide variety of springtime greetings. If you are jonesing for a little spring these days, and I think we all are, the February 2026 My Monthly Hero Kits fit the bill. I think the bunnies are adorable. The layering stencils work beautifully, and there's a large enough assortment of flowers to satisfy almost anyone. And whether you like coloring or ink blending and stenciling, there's more than enough options in this kit for everyone. If you want to grab one of these kits for yourself, please use my links in the description down below. I do get a small commission from anything you buy at Hero Arts at no cost to you, and that helps keep the wheels turning and the inspiration coming. It is always supremely appreciated. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me here today. I hope I was able to inspire you and perhaps send a little spring warmth your way. Let me know which cards are your favorites. If you enjoyed this post, please click the thumbs up at the top of this page. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please click that subscribe button and the bell to notify you when new videos come out. We would love to have you join us here. Please take a few moments to like me, list me, pin me, post me, just share this post with everybody you can think of. And remember, don't run with scissors. As always, I send you and yours love and light and happy crafting. For more detailed information, better pictures, and product links, please visit my website at cardcutups.com.